I'm a 29-year-old woman, and on paper I should have had everything together. I worked a solid corporate job that paid me far more than most people my age in my area. My friends often told me how lucky I was, how stable my life seemed, how I must be sitting on piles of savings. What none of them knew was that my paycheck barely stayed in my account long enough for me to look at it. Almost every dollar I earned went straight into holding my family together. It started years ago, slowly, and then it became normal. My parents would fall behind on rent, and I was the one to fix it. At first it felt good to help. They called me dependable, the one they could rely on. My mom loved to tell everyone I was the rock of the family. It sounded nice, but really it was just another way of saying I was the safety net they leaned on every time something went wrong. When my younger brother, who's 24 now, didn't have health insurance, it was me who paid for his medical bills. He'd text me about prescriptions or doctor visits, and I'd transfer money without thinking twice. I told myself it was just temporary, just until he got steady work, but that temporary stretched into years. Holidays weren't much different. Most families share the cost of big gatherings, but mine always ended with me footing the entire grocery bill. Sometimes it even included the cost of travel, since no one else seemed able to afford it. They praised me at the table, telling relatives how generous I was, but no one ever offered to split the cost the next time. It was simply assumed I would do it again. That assumption grew with everything. My dad, who was supposed to be semi-retired, constantly leaned on me for temporary loans. Each one came with promises that he'd pay me back once things stabilized, but not a single cent ever made its way back to me. At some point, even the word loan became meaningless because we both knew it was never coming back. My sister, who's 27, loved to brag about how she and her fiancé were saving for a down payment on a house. She'd smile while talking about her growing savings account. But the reason she could save so comfortably was because I was covering all the family emergencies she never had to pitch in for. I noticed it, but no one else seemed to. Instead, they compared us, painting her as the smart one planning for her future, while I was the single one who could afford to help everyone else. Even my car wasn't safe. My brother would take it without asking, shrugging it off with excuses like, "You have two, I don't even have one." My parents acted like that was reasonable. They told me I should be more understanding because I had more than he did. Every time I even hinted at being stressed about money, my mom would shut it down. She'd say things like, "You're single, you don't have kids, you can afford it." There was no space to argue with that. If I pushed back, the guilt trip would start. They would remind me that family is everything, that I should be proud to help them, that it was my duty as their daughter. And so I kept giving, telling myself it was just what needed to be done. Relatives joined in too. They loved to call me the responsible one, the one who made the family proud. But their praise felt more like pressure. Every compliment was just another expectation that I'd be there to fix whatever went wrong. I couldn't remember the last time anyone asked me if I needed help. It wasn't even a thought in their minds because I had a good job, and in their eyes that meant I could handle anything. For years, I told myself it was fine. I convinced myself I was strong enough to carry it, that it would even out eventually. But slowly, I realized I wasn't living my own life. My six-figure salary should have set me up for comfort. But when I looked at my bank account, years of paying thousands each month for rent, groceries, and medical bills left almost nothing behind. Every month, my paycheck disappeared into rent payments, groceries, medical bills, and loans that weren't loans at all. The breaking point came when I started looking into buying a place of my own. I wanted stability. I wanted a home that was mine. But when I met with the bank, I found out I couldn't qualify for what I wanted. On paper, my income looked good, but my finances told a different story. My savings were nearly non-existent because of the constant drain of family emergencies. My debts weren't mine, but they had become mine because I had paid for them. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and went through all the numbers. Years of paychecks, years of bills, years of helping. It was all there in front of me, clear as day. My life didn't belong to me anymore. It belonged to them. And for what? They weren't thankful. They weren't supportive. My generosity had stopped being appreciated years ago. It had become the bare minimum of what they expected from me. I thought about the times I'd asked for help in small ways, just to see if anyone would step up. No one ever did. They brushed it off, reminding me again and again that I could afford it, that I was better off than the rest of them. But I wasn't better off. I was drowning in responsibilities that weren't mine. That's when I decided I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep being the family's ATM, the one they ran to every time something went wrong, the one who sacrificed everything while they saved and bragged and carried on with their lives. I made the choice that from now on, I would stop giving. I would stop fixing every problem they created. I would start living my life for myself. I knew it wouldn't go over well. I knew there would be backlash, guilt, anger, but I couldn't ignore reality anymore. I had spent years keeping everyone else afloat, and now it was time to figure out if I could keep myself afloat without being dragged under by the weight of everyone else. That decision changed everything. The first time I told my parents I wasn't going to cover their rent anymore, it happened on a Sunday evening. We were at their apartment, and the table still had plates from dinner scattered across it. My mom brought up the rent like she always did, slipping it into the conversation as if it was routine. She reminded me it was due next week, how things were tight, how they just needed me to take care of it. That's when I said no. I told them I couldn't keep paying it, that they needed to figure out their own bills. The look on my mom's face was like I had just told her I was moving across the world and never coming back. She was stunned for a second, then her voice rose as she asked how I could abandon my own family when they needed me the most. My dad leaned back in his chair and shook his head, muttering that it was just a temporary setback, like always. He said things would get back on track soon, that I just needed to help this one last time. But I stood firm. I told them I wasn't covering rent anymore. Not this month, Not next month. Not ever again. The argument didn't stop there. By the next morning, my phone started buzzing with messages. My sister called me selfish, saying that I didn't have a husband or kids, no mortgage, no daycare bills, nothing tying me down. She told me I had no excuse not to help, and that I was just hoarding money for myself while the rest of them struggled. I pointed out that the only reason she even had savings to put toward a down payment was because I had been carrying the weight of everyone else's expenses. She never had to pay for groceries during holidays, never had to bail out our parents, never had to cover sudden emergencies. I told her straight that her comfort came at my expense. It didn't end there. My brother sent me a string of angry texts, saying he wouldn't be able to afford his medication anymore if I didn't step up. He told me I was ruining his life, that I was leaving him to suffer. I offered to sit down with him and help find affordable healthcare options, or even figure out payment plans through clinics, but I told him I wasn't paying his bills anymore. His reply was short, accusing me of turning my back on him. After that, the family group chat went silent. Normally it was buzzing with updates, small talk and jokes, but now it was like everyone had vanished. Days went by with no messages. It was the quietest it had been in years, and the silence felt heavier than the arguments. A few days later, my parents called me again. Their voices were sharp, tense. They told me that without my help, they were facing eviction. The rent was too high, and they couldn't make it work on their own. I didn't yell, I didn't argue, I just told them they should consider downsizing to a smaller apartment. I even spent time looking up affordable places nearby, and sent them the listings, but they refused to even consider it. They told me moving would be humiliating. Everyone knew their current place was their home, and leaving it would be a sign they couldn't manage. They said it would ruin their reputation, that people would talk. They would rather risk eviction than let anyone see them in a smaller place. Not long after that, my aunt called me. She didn't waste time with small talk. She went straight into guilt, saying I was the successful one, that I had the good job and no dependents, so why was I punishing my parents? She said they had always been there for me, and now when they needed me most, I was abandoning them. Her words were sharp, and she made it sound like I was doing something cruel, rather than drawing a boundary. I started noticing the small ways my family began excluding me. Little updates about what was going on, plans for dinners or get-togethers. None of it reached me anymore. Conversations that used to include me now went on without me, and I only heard about them through cousins or by accident. It was clear they were pulling away, making me the outsider. In the middle of all this chaos, I did something I hadn't done in years. On payday, when my check cleared, I transferred money into my own savings account. Just a simple transfer, but it was the first time I wasn't sending money out to cover someone else's bills. The number sat there in black and white, untouched, and for the first time in a long while, it stayed in my account. It wasn't much yet, but it was mine. My own money, not borrowed, not promised, not owed to anyone. It felt like the beginning of something new, even as I knew the storm for my family was just getting started. The fallout didn't stop. The next weekend, I heard through a cousin that my parents were telling relatives I had abandoned them. They said they didn't know how they'd keep a roof over their heads because their own daughter had turned her back on them. That story started spreading, and I could feel the judgment from extended family members who didn't know the full truth. At the same time, my sister made sure to remind me of the burden she and her fiancé would have to take on now. She made it sound like I had forced her into an impossible position, even though she had spent years building her savings untouched. She called herself the one stepping up now, painting herself as the responsible child. The tension grew quickly, and the quietness of the group chat turned into pointed silence in person. At dinners, the atmosphere shifted. My family didn't laugh as much, didn't include me in conversations, and when I spoke, their responses were short. The distance between us was growing by the day. Even with the cold shoulders, I didn't go back on my decision. I stopped transferring money, stopped covering their rent, stopped answering every financial demand. It was a line I had drawn, and for once, I didn't let them pull me back across it. The strange part was how quickly they adapted, not to living without my money, but to cutting me out when I refused to give it. I realized that the approval I used to get from them was never about me, it was always about what I could provide. Without the money, I was just another person they could leave out. But in that silence, in that distance, I found space I hadn't had in years. For the first time, I wasn't immediately rushing to put out someone else's fire. The guilt didn't vanish, but it no longer controlled me. The resentment from my family was clear, and I knew this was only the start. What I didn't realize then was just how far they would go to make sure I fell back in line. Not long after I cut my parents off, I started hearing things through cousins. Word spread quickly, and soon I learned my parents were telling everyone in the family that I had abandoned them financially. They painted it like I had suddenly walked away from my responsibilities, leaving them to suffer while I lived comfortably. By the time it reached me, the story had been repeated so many times that some relatives looked at me differently, as if I had done something cruel. The first time I felt it directly was at a family dinner. I hadn't skipped out yet, so I showed up like usual, and the moment I walked in, I could tell something was off. The atmosphere wasn't the same. Conversations hushed when I passed, and people's eyes lingered longer than they used to. I tried to ignore it until one of my aunts, in front of everyone, looked at the bag I was carrying and made a comment about my designer handbag. She said it must be nice to spend money on luxuries instead of family. I froze for a second, but before I could even respond, my sister jumped into the spotlight. She announced proudly that she and her fiancé had finally saved enough to buy a house. The table clapped, relatives congratulated her, and she made sure to mention that it was thanks to years of saving and discipline. Then, almost as if it were planned, a cousin asked why I hadn't bought a house yet, considering how much I earned. Their eyes turned toward me, expecting some neat answer. All I said was that I couldn't buy one because I had been paying for everything else. The words hung in the air, and the table went silent. No one had a clever response. Plates scraped, forks clinked, and the awkwardness spread. My sister looked annoyed. My dad shifted uncomfortably, and soon the conversations picked back up as if nothing had been said. Later that night, when people were leaving, my dad pulled me aside. He cornered me near the doorway and accused me of being ungrateful. He said I had embarrassed the family in front of everyone, that I should have kept quiet instead of airing private matters. He didn't care about what was true, only how it looked to others. I walked away from that conversation, replaying everything, and I realized I couldn't think of a single time my family had ever helped me financially. It had always been one-sided. Every loan, every emergency, every rent payment had come from me. When it came to giving, I was the only one. The very next week, the situation escalated again. My brother showed up at my apartment without warning. He was pacing in the hallway when I opened the door, already agitated. He told me he had an urgent crisis and needed cash right away. His words tumbled out in a rush, all about bills and how desperate he was. He expected me to hand him money like always, no questions asked. I told him no. I reminded him again that I wasn't paying his bills anymore, but I offered to sit down with him, help him find resources, clinics, even programs that could ease the costs. He didn't care. His face twisted with anger, and before storming out, he spat out that I was a traitor to the family. The words stung more than the shouting. That night, my phone lit up with messages from my sister. She accused me of ruining our parents' reputation. According to her, everyone now saw them as struggling because of me, and she laid the blame squarely at my feet. I scrolled through the texts, each one harsher than the last, and eventually set the phone down without replying. At work, though, the contrast couldn't have been sharper. For the first time in years, payday came and I didn't immediately scramble to move money out to cover emergencies. I paid my own bills, transferred money to savings, and still had enough left over to breathe. The relief of not living on edge every 2 weeks was something I hadn't experienced since my early 20s. Back home, the divide with my family grew. They began excluding me from weekend dinners, get-togethers, and traditions. Plans that I normally heard about in the family chat or through calls were happening without me, and I'd only find out through photos shared by cousins on social media. It wasn't subtle, they were cutting me out to punish me. One cousin, who I've always been close to, quietly pulled me aside one afternoon. They told me my parents had now shifted their pressure onto my sister. Since I was no longer paying, my parents expected her to take on more, and she was already resenting it. She had her mortgage plans with her fiancé, and suddenly the extra financial burden was pulling her down. She complained to friends that it was too much, but in front of family she still pretended she was stepping up proudly. Meanwhile, with my own money finally free, I booked a small solo trip. Nothing extravagant, just a weekend away to clear my head. It was my first real trip in years that wasn't tied to family holidays or obligations. I walked through quiet streets, ate at restaurants alone, and took in the peace. It wasn't about luxury, it was about freedom, even if only for a few days. When I came back, the tension hadn't cooled. In fact, it got worse. A few days after my return, I received a message from my mother. It wasn't long, but it cut deep. She wrote, "If family isn't everything to you, then maybe you don't need us at all." That line sat heavy. It wasn't just disappointment anymore. It was an ultimatum. They had drawn a line. If I wasn't going to give them money, then I wasn't really part of the family. From that point on, it was clear the situation was no longer about helping with bills or rent. It was about control, about making sure I stayed in the role they had placed me in for years. And since I refused to go back, the backlash was only going to intensify. After my mother's message about family not being everything, I decided to pull back. I stopped checking the family group chat every hour, stopped calling to see how things were going, and kept my focus on work. I paid my own bills, set reminders for my own deadlines, and let the rest fall quiet. For the first time in a long time, my life revolved around myself, not them. It lasted about a week before the next blow came. One morning at work, while I was heading into the lobby with my coffee, I noticed a familiar figure pacing near the front desk. It was my dad. He looked out of place in the glass lobby, surrounded by people in suits and badges. Before I could even react, he spotted me and strode over, speaking tensely but low enough for only me to hear. He insisted that I come back to covering their rent. He said he didn't care about my excuses, that the family was falling apart because of me, and I had to fix it. I quickly pulled him to the side, away from the curious stares of coworkers passing by. I told him firmly that showing up at my job was not acceptable. He shook his head, his face red, and snapped that I was choosing strangers in suits over my own family. His words echoed in the marble lobby, and I could feel the eyes on us, even though I tried to block them out. That evening, the storm didn't die down. My mom called me, her voice cold and sharp. She told me I had until the end of the month to decide if I was going to resume paying their rent. If I refused, she warned, then my sister and her fiancé would be forced to carry the burden, even though they didn't deserve it. Not long after, my sister called me herself. She said she and her fiancé had their own plans, their mortgage to think about, and now they were being dragged into this because of me. She made it clear they resented the situation, but at the same time she wanted me to understand that if I didn't pick it up again, the fallout would be on me. I stayed calm. I told them they needed to start managing their own responsibilities, that it was time for everyone to handle their own bills. That one sentence sent the family group chat into chaos. Within minutes, my phone was lighting up nonstop. My brother accused me of killing our parents by abandoning them. My sister fired back with long paragraphs about how I was jealous of her stability and success. My dad chimed in with short, angry messages about how ungrateful I had become after everything they had supposedly done for me. The chat, which had once been filled with lighthearted jokes and updates, turned into a war zone. Then just as quickly as it blew up, it went silent again. Messages carried on between them, but I noticed I was no longer tagged, no longer included in updates about family plans. Weekend dinners that I usually got texts about suddenly happened without me. I found out from photos posted online that I hadn't even known they were gathering. A cousin eventually confirmed it for me. They told me quietly that the family had started planning a big dinner but hadn't invited me. It wasn't an accident, it was intentional. They were trying to socially isolate me, make me feel excluded until I gave in. But instead of caving, I found myself doubling down on work. With less chaos spilling over from home, my focus sharpened. My boss noticed. One afternoon, after a presentation, he pulled me aside and mentioned he was recommending me for a promotion. It wasn't official yet, but hearing those words reminded me that outside of my family, people actually saw my effort and valued it. I started setting aside money consistently, transferring into my savings account every paycheck. Watching the numbers grow felt like watching a wall being built brick by brick. Something solid, something mine. For years, I hadn't had the chance to see that number climb because it always went out as quickly as it came in. Now it stayed, and it grew. With the thought of a future finally taking shape, I booked a consultation with a realtor. I didn't commit to anything yet, but I wanted to know my options. For the first time, I toured listings with someone who treated me as a buyer, not just a source of cash for someone else's bills. The feeling of walking through a space that could be mine, untouched by anyone else's demands, stayed with me. The end of the month came faster than I expected. My mom's deadline hung over my head, but when it arrived, I stayed firm. I didn't send a transfer. I didn't cover the rent. For the first time in years, not a single dollar of mine went into their home. They scrambled. My sister fumed. My brother raged, but I didn't step back across that line. That month closed with something I hadn't experienced in almost a decade: control. My money was mine, my choices were mine, and the chains of guilt were starting to break, even as the family tightened theirs in retaliation. Not long after the month ended without me paying their rent, my sister made a big announcement in the family group chat. She said that she and her fiancé had stepped up and were now covering our parents' rent. The way she phrased it made it sound like she was rescuing them from disaster, and suddenly she was the hero. My mom chimed in right away, praising her for being so responsible, telling everyone how proud she was of her. It was as if the 6 years I had quietly carried that same burden had been wiped from memory in a single moment. Through cousins and other relatives, I began hearing what version of the story was being passed around. People were told that I had abandoned my parents in their old age, that I had turned my back when they needed me most. It didn't matter that I had kept them afloat for years. In their retelling, I was selfish and my sister was the savior. A few weeks later, I went to a baby shower for a cousin. I knew some family would be there, but I wasn't prepared for how bold they'd become. An aunt cornered me near the dessert table. She leaned in, lowered her voice, and asked why I was punishing my parents after everything they had done for me. I answered simply, saying I had paid their rent for 6 years straight. She shook her head and dismissed it, telling me family doesn't keep score. The word stung, because while no one wanted to keep score, everyone seemed to remember only what I wasn't doing now, never what I had already done. Meanwhile, things at home for my parents didn't ease up. My brother lost his part-time job, and the little money he had been bringing in stopped completely. That meant even more weight fell onto my parents, and by extension, my sister and her fiancé. I overheard her once at a gathering complaining quietly to friends that she felt like she was drowning under the constant financial demands from our parents. She painted herself as exhausted and overwhelmed, but when she turned back toward the family, she wore the badge of responsibility proudly, continuing the story that she was the one holding everything together. While all of that played out in the background, my own life at work was moving forward. The promotion my boss had mentioned became official. My salary went up, and with it came new projects and responsibilities. I celebrated quietly with coworkers, enjoying the recognition I had earned. But I told no one in my family. I knew what would happen if they found out. Their demands would double, and every new dollar I made would already be spoken for in their minds. Around the same time, my realtor showed me a condo that immediately felt different from the others. It wasn't huge or flashy, but it was in a good area. The space felt open, and for the first time I could picture myself living somewhere that was mine and mine alone. The thought of it stuck with me for days, and I realized I was seriously considering it in a way I never had before. One evening, during a casual conversation with my sister, I mentioned that I was looking at places just in passing. Her reaction was immediate and sharp. She accused me of wanting to run away and live in a castle while everyone else suffered. To her, my independence was framed as betrayal, as if me wanting stability meant I was abandoning everyone all over again. Not long after that, my dad left me a voicemail. His voice was low, heavy, and he said he didn't even recognize me anymore. He told me I had changed, that I wasn't the daughter he knew. It was short, but the weight of it was heavier than any long lecture. I started filling my weekends with things I hadn't had the chance to try before. I signed up for an art class, something small but enjoyable, and spent time outside of the constant family drama. Week by week, I carved out time that belonged only to me. Then came a text from my mom that made my stomach drop. It popped up late at night, with no context before or after. It said, "When you see us on the street, don't say we didn't speak up about how much we needed you." The words sat on my phone screen, sharp and chilling, more threatening than anything they had sent before. The line had shifted again. It was no longer just guilt or exclusion. It was something darker, and while my sister continued to bask in the role of the new savior, I knew the pressure around me was only building higher. The condo that had stuck in my mind kept pulling me back. I toured it again, walked through every room, and pictured what it would be like to live there. After weeks of thinking, I decided not to delay anymore. I signed the paperwork. My realtor congratulated me with a firm handshake and a wide smile. For the first time, It felt like I was actually investing in something that was mine, something for my own future, instead of pouring everything into a bottomless pit. The news didn't stay private for long. Somehow, word spread through the family within days. I hadn't told anyone, but cousins talk, and soon my phone was buzzing nonstop. My sister was the first to lash out. She sent me a long, furious message accusing me of abandoning the family just to flaunt my wealth. She wrote that while everyone else was struggling to make ends meet, I was running off to play house in a condo, like I was showing off how much better I thought I was. Not long after, my mom called, sobbing into the phone. She told me I was choosing cold walls over warm family. She said she couldn't believe I would pick bricks and furniture over the people who raised me. Her words came between gasps of crying, but every sentence was sharp, crafted to make me second-guess myself. Then my dad called. His voice wasn't sad, it was angry. He told me I had humiliated them by making such a decision without their input. He said family should be consulted on big life steps like this, that I had disrespected them by keeping it a secret. According to him, my purchase wasn't just a personal choice, it was a public insult. The situation exploded further when my brother found out. He came to me with demands, not congratulations. He said since I now had a condo, I should let him move in rent-free, just until he got back on his feet. He acted like it was obvious, like my new space was a family resource the same way my bank account had always been. I told him no. I stated clearly that this was my home, not a crash pad, not a place for anyone else to take over. His face twisted with anger, but I didn't back down. That refusal lit another fire in the group chat. Messages came one after another, each more hostile than the last. My sister accused me of betrayal. My mom called me selfish. My dad threw in comments about ungrateful children, and my brother accused me of being cold-hearted. The chat that once shared jokes and updates now felt like a courtroom, with me on trial and everyone else hurling accusations. In the middle of that storm, I got a message from an uncle I rarely spoke to. He reached out privately, quietly. He told me he respected me for finally putting myself first. He said he'd watched for years how much I had carried, and that I had done more than enough. His words were short but carried more weight than the dozens of angry ones from the rest of my family. That night though, when the messages stopped and the calls went quiet, I sat alone. I looked at the signed paperwork on my table, at the folders from the realtor, and I felt both liberated and heartbroken. On one hand, I had taken the biggest step toward my independence. On the other, the price was my family's approval, which they dangled like a carrot I could never reach. The next morning, I transferred the down payment. The money left my account, large and final. With that, I was officially committed to my new life. There was no undoing it, no going back. At work, I threw myself into projects with more energy than before. I stayed late, volunteered for assignments, and poured my time into building the career that was giving me the independence I had fought so hard to protect. The recognition from coworkers and the steady growth in my role filled the silence that my family had left behind. A week later, a cousin asked me to meet for brunch. Over coffee and eggs, they confided what I already suspected. The extended family was split down the middle. Some pitied my parents, repeating the story that I had abandoned them in their old age. Others quietly admitted they thought my parents had exploited me for years, draining me while praising me just enough to keep me giving. My cousin told me not everyone believed the story my parents were spreading, and that gave me a strange kind of comfort. Finally, move-in day arrived. I carried boxes up the stairs, opened the door, and stepped into the condo as the official owner. The rooms echoed with emptiness, stacked with cardboard, but it felt different than anywhere I had lived before. It was quiet, peaceful, and fully mine. I stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by boxes, and realized this was the first time in my life I was living on my own terms. But even in that moment of triumph, I knew the story with my family wasn't ending. Their resentment wasn't fading, it was deepening, sharpening, and waiting for the next chapter. My first night in the condo felt unreal. The place was quiet, no voices arguing in the background, no phone buzzing with family demands. Just me, four walls, and the faint hum of the fridge. For the first time in years, the space I was in was fully mine. That peace didn't last long. A couple of days later, my sister called. She wanted me to invite her fiancé, and my parents over so they could inspect what I wasted money on. Her words weren't masked as curiosity, they were framed like they had a right to tour it. I told her no. This condo was my private space, not an extension of the family house. That boundary hit harder than any refusal of money had. Soon after, my dad left me a voicemail. His tone was bitter, his words sharp. He said I had shamed them by moving into a place like this and keeping it to myself. According to him, milestones like buying a home were family events, and my choice to celebrate it alone was a mark of disrespect. Through a cousin, I found out the truth about what was going on behind the scenes. My sister and her fiancé were cracking under the weight of paying both their new mortgage and my parents' rent. They had stepped into the role I once filled, but now with their own bills piling up, they were stretched thinner than they ever expected. To make things worse, my brother had moved back into my parents' house. With no job and no contribution, he was draining them further, eating into food, utilities, and whatever scraps of money were left. Then came the group message from my mom. It was blunt and cold. She wrote that since I no longer contributed financially, I was excluded from family traditions. Dinners, holidays, birthdays, I was no longer welcome. The message wasn't private either. It went to everyone, like a public announcement of my exile. My sister made sure to drive the point home. She threw a housewarming party for her new house, sent invites all over the family, but left me off the list. Photos later popped up online, of everyone gathered in her decorated living room, smiling, posing, celebrating. My absence was deliberate, noticeable, and intended to sting. That same weekend, I hosted a small gathering in my own condo. Just a few close friends, nothing extravagant. Pizza boxes on the counter, drinks lined up on the table, laughter filling the rooms. For the first time, I looked around and felt surrounded only by people who were there because they cared, not because they wanted something from me. Work became my safe place. The promotion turned into bigger projects, more recognition, and colleagues who encouraged me instead of draining me. They became my main circle of support. The contrast between their encouragement and my family's resentment couldn't have been sharper. One afternoon at the grocery store, I ran into an aunt I hadn't seen in months. She lowered her voice, glanced around, and admitted quietly that my sister was cracking under the pressure. She told me I had done what anyone else in my position would have done, that no one could keep carrying the weight forever. It was the first time someone in the family had acknowledged it out loud. Months passed, and I watched my savings grow steadily. Each transfer into my account built a cushion I had never been able to keep before. At the same time, word trickled in through cousins that my parents' finances were unraveling. The story they told everyone else kept changing. Sometimes it was bad luck, sometimes it was me abandoning them. But behind closed doors, the truth was catching up. Then, almost predictably, my parents reached out again. This time it was a long message filled with guilt. They wrote about how life is short, how they needed me back, how family should stay together no matter what. The words were laced with the same emotional hooks I'd heard for years. I didn't argue. I didn't fight. I replied with calm finality. I told them I still loved them, but I would not return to being their provider. Any future relationship we had would have to be separate from money. That holiday season, I decorated my condo on my own. Lights along the balcony, a tree in the corner, candles glowing on the table. I spent the evening sipping cocoa and listening to music, not rushing to cover someone else's bills or pretending to celebrate under the weight of resentment. For years, my family told me family is everything. But standing in my condo surrounded by warmth that was mine, I finally understood the truth. Family isn't everything if it's built only on obligation and money. Real family has to be built on love, respect, and choice. And for the first time, I had chosen mine.